So I'm here with Dr. Jared Grant from the Ohio State University's College of Agricultural and Economics. Dr. Grant, thank you for taking the time to chat informally with me today about your work, data and evaluation more broadly. And to jump right into things, could you take the time to introduce yourself, your professional background, and all that good stuff?
Perfect. And thank you, Dr. St. John, for inviting me. Like I said, I'm Dr. Jared Grant. I received my undergrad from Florida A&M University, master's and PhD from the University of Georgia. And my research interest broadly is on food security, food accessibility, and pretty much understanding trust within the community and how that impacts the success of food initiatives such as farmers markets or grocery stores. So, and broadly, my overall scope is, or how I try to do research is, as long as it's impacting the community and using data to pretty much tell a story or aid in helping or alleviating issues in these communities.
Gotcha, gotcha. And how would you define food access, just so we understand clearly? Is it simply whether or not I could, I don't know, get my hands on oranges and good meat, or like what does that tend to look like more technically, if anything?
That's my favorite question. So before we always looked at food access based upon a term that we is kind of going out of the way called food deserts, whether you either live in a food desert or you don't. But what does that even really mean? Going with your point about, okay, if it's based upon healthy things such as fruits and vegetables, or is it based upon the number of retailers I have? And with food access, that's the major point in it. It's based upon your perception but also what's around, such as I may live in an area that has no food, like no grocery stores, but I
Mhm.
may view like a Dollar Tree or a convenience store as a grocery store. And that's more common in more like rural areas. Or I may live in a rural area, but work in an area that's urban and may get food on my way coming home from work. Meaning I may not believe I live in a food desert or low food access area. So there's various different factors. And like I said previously, there's always been like the USDA Economic Research Service has measures where like such as they flag a census tract based upon if it's 1 mile, if you're 1 mile away from a supermarket, if you're in an urban area, 10 miles away if you're in a rural. And they have various ones where it's also like 0.5 or 20 miles rural. So there's various different factors that can like determine whether you're in the food access. And what my food research primarily focuses on is creating a continuous measure that pretty much includes multiple factors such as I mentioned, like where you live, where you work, or the number of retailers close to you, the number of retailers in your neighboring areas.
Mm,
So yeah,
okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I guess this might dovetail somewhat into the questions I have here for you today. One is, in your experience, would you be able to describe one of the better evaluations that you've been involved with, particularly any strengths,
mhm,
weaknesses associated with the evaluation?
definitely. So what my dissertation when I was finishing was pretty much on food security, food accessibility, and trust. And what I did was I created what I called what's known in literature as a trust game, where I used to create a game theoretic model that embeds residential trust in a food initiative in the decisions of stakeholders, like people that want to make grocery stores or a farmer's market in the area,
Mhm.
and placing them in within their community. So with a game theory model, and like broadly speaking, it's two players making a decision that's best for both of them. And that best for both response is known as like a Nash equilibrium or just optimal choice. So in my game theory, I'm going through the game theory model. The stakeholders decide they want to build a grocery store in a low food access area.
Mhm.
So they have two choices they can make at first. They can either engage in community efforts, meaning like being involved in the community, understanding what's going on in this community, or not. There's an added cost for engaging in those efforts. So that's why we see a lot of people or a lot of grocery stores just do traditional marketing techniques, such as just putting a sign up saying, hey, grocery store coming soon, and that's it, not really getting involved. So after that decision, the store's open. The residents then have to make a decision where they want to pretty much patron the store, I mean, regularly patron, purchase groceries. This becomes their primary store, or just casually visit the store, meaning I may pop in once in a while. Even if it's closer to me and convenient, I may not truly frequent it.
Mhm.
So because grocery stores are based upon profit, like they're not a public good, they have to maintain a profit in order to succeed. After some time's passed, the stakeholders must decide, okay, are we going to renew the lease and maintain this grocery store in this community? Renew the lease, but not maintain the grocery store, meaning neglect it and save on costs because it's not making enough profits to maintain the store. Or C, close the store. And that's the end of the game. So, like, depending on the actions of the residents and the two actions of the stakeholders, this creates roughly multiple different options that the stakeholder, like different scenarios.
Right.
And in reality, because I wanted to make this as realistic as possible, because this is what occurs in many areas, there's different types of each player, such as the stakeholders can be ones that offer a price discount, or they can be ones that offer no price discount, like just open a normal store.
Mhm.
Or they can, and the residents can be based upon pretty much a residence that's trusting or a resident that's more skeptical. And the skepticism pretty much can leans on, I don't believe this grocery store will last. I don't believe in the quality. Pretty much they just lack trust within this store being successful in their community.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. If we were to apply that in terms of, would you say the overall, it seems like there can be different types of outcomes that come from this game model. Um, is there an ideal outcome that you would want to kind of extrapolate from that work? Like, is there, I don't know, a
Hmm.
gold standard of combinations that we want to see on the ground?
So great point. So what I did was because you're right, there's multiple different Nash equilibriums that can arise, such as a top one that's common is the residents are skeptical, don't frequent the store, they casually frequent it, and the stakeholders close the store. That's a valid option for them. Another valid option for them is the residents are trusting, they regularly patron the store, and the stakeholders maintain the store. Pretty much a maintained store and residents regularly frequent it. That's what I would call like a successful outcome. So I broadly labeled them and put them in bins where it's successful, sustainable, or unsuccessful. Where successful outcome is where it's a maintained store pretty much.
Mm,
Sustainable is any outcome where the store is not maintained or neglected and the residents are just casually frequented. And unsuccessful means the store closed. So
gotcha.
kind of bend them. But yeah, there's multiple different outcomes and combinations that can occur.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Interesting. In some of the earlier weeks in this course, we cover logic models, and we kind of break things down where it's kind of what is the potential intervention that's being looked at and the ideal outcomes you'd want from that situation. And I guess something here you kind of broke down what that can look like, whether it's um, store closure or ideally in the successful description you gave, the store being maintained and or just remaining opened at the same
Mhm.
time. Yeah. Um, hmm. So I guess with that, this might speak to data collection in some ways. You're making me wonder if there are programs or interventions created to do exactly what you described, the successful outcome to have food access strengthened by this intervention that allows for more grocery stores to be in an area and so forth. What are some of the ways in which uh, evaluators would measure that or kind of utilize data to assess that, to track it? What would that look on like in a hands-on approach?
Okay. So the interesting part that about that is the whole game that I mentioned is a game theoretic model. So it's theory and using what's known as Bayesian theory, where it's based upon information. So like you created a prior distribution, like I said things based upon like this is a belief that this can happen.
Mhm.
And then data, it can reinforce the likelihood of this outcome can occur. So, for example, in my game theory model, I can see if trust levels are here, I can see, okay, the store is maintained. This will be a successful outcome. Versus if trust levels are low, I can see that, okay, this will be an unsuccessful outcome. And with data, I can see exactly, or with perceived trust levels, I can see, okay, we're in this area, we're here. And in empirical work on this, or early empirical work I did was I surveyed Los Angeles and asked them questions geared towards like their trust perceptions, like what is your trust in your local government's decisions? What is your trust in your local food access? And created a composite trust score. So then I created that ranging from 0 to 100. And then I placed that trust score inside the my game theoretic model to showcase, okay, in Los Angeles, they're more likely to have a sustainable store over here and a successful store over here. But more broadly speaking, regarding like what food access is, regarding understanding trust levels and perception, it would take under because we've seen numerous grocery stores in the news that open, close, or deemed underperforming. So you could track it through historical like news articles. You can, if you can, communicate with local retailers, which can be, since they're private, be less likely to like share that unless you have a connection and things like that.
Mm.
Or just using, in some cases, public data where we can measure like the number of stores that are like opening. So
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I'm mapping it out in my head as you're chatting. So there's this survey instrument that helped with getting the trust variable set up, but then also in terms of again at a macro level, looking at kind of store outcomes, you then could use uh, news media data, data from news outlets, and potentially official records around store closures.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention this, but so to make it even more realistic, we actually contacted a person who's over grocery stores in southern Georgia who gave me estimates and helped me understand like, okay, like grocery stores operate on leasing. They like for a store to be maintained, 25% of their like sales have to be dedicated, 25% of their cost is dedicated towards refreshing or making sure fresh fruits and vegetables are restocked, or like actually remodeling the store and including things such as like self-checkout or things like that, or rearranging. So the wear and tear.
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's interesting. That's interesting. Huh. So so you're making me think about a couple things because it's like you have this game model that's based off of uh actual data and it's kind of is it like a simulation that's kind of happening in some ways here?
So I mentioned Bayesian theory or Bayesian statistics. Are you familiar with it?
Uh basic, very basic level.
It's- Okay, so I'll keep it real simple. So with Bayesian statistics, it's based upon the probability of a belief occurring. So I have a belief that this store will close. Because of this, the store may close or whatever. It depends on the probability of it. So with my game theory model is based upon is setting up prior beliefs. Like it's creating a framework where this is an outcome where a store can close, this is an outcome where a store is successful. And with actual data, you can treat that as a likelihood function, where the likelihood of something occurring, such as if I see numerous news articles highlighting a store has closed in this community, I can add that to my game theory model to showcase, okay, this is what happens in this community. Or seeing racial demographics, or seeing, or how I did survey trust perceptions. All these likelihood functions can turn my prior beliefs into what's known as posterior beliefs, where prior beliefs combined with the likelihood function.
That makes sense. That makes sense. In some ways too, it's like it's hmm, it's I'm trying to figure out how to synthesize it in some ways because it's like you can use this to figure out in what cases is a program successful or not.
Mhm.
And when we when we also talk about policy interventions and analyses, I'm thinking and I'm talking out loud. Sometimes it works, it doesn't. We'll see. But in this class, one of the things we covered is, all right, you collect all your data points. Maybe it's an experimental design. Maybe it's some uh, group tests, t-tests that we may run. Maybe some regression analyses we run on the outcomes of interest and so forth. This overlaps with that because we're now where we're doing exactly that. We're predicting
Yeah.
whether it's successful or not. A binary outcome in some ways, if we were to set it up in that way, whether the
Yeah.
growth, yeah.
Yeah, and because of having like economics background and like doing with a lot of econometrics, what you're
Mhm.
saying resonates exactly with what I do every day. Where running a regression, trying to understand like, okay, like correlation, and then taking it a step further, understanding is there a causal relationship with things. So with what this model and what Bayesian statistics pretty much highlights is the fact that unlike with normal like regression,
Mhm.
it can be influenced based upon things such as things done in the past or data in the past, or you can learn from what's been done. Now, granted, it depends because, like I said, this is depending on a framework. And because this framework is important, if you don't believe the framework, then my results can be viewed as biased. So that's why it takes understanding the literature, understanding the data, understanding numerous factors such as like the concept of where stores are located or things like that to measure, okay, this framework holds. Like me consulting with a grocery store operator helped, okay, reframe the framework and make sure that this is realistic and yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I guess in some ways too, even outside of like a theoretical model, even practically in doing an evaluation, I guess someone could scrutinize an evaluation and say, hey, I don't know if that's a good measure for for that at all, just in general, or that's not a good data source that should be used here or something like that.
Reviewer number two, right?
Yeah, review number two. That brings us to another question here, which is in kind of looking at this econometric approach to evaluation and so forth, and research more broadly, what are some of like the weaknesses or challenges associated just like that you've seen and you've experienced?
Definitely. The biggest challenge is lack of data, where you can create a framework or understanding where things are going, like in the case of my game theory model,
Hmm.
but may not have data readily available, such as having sales data to understand, okay, like this is profit a major driver of success? One can affirm that in the framework, but having that data is a totally different thing. So that's one. And the second one is more causal. So similar to like how you mentioned earlier regarding like running linear regressions, things
Hmm.
like that, it causality, like because t-tests typically show like correlation. In order to establish causality, one requires like a framework and a bunch of robustness checks. And in my field, that's where you can impact policy. That's where you can showcase where, okay, this causes this, as I mentioned earlier.
Right, right. So y'all like, all right, we're not just interested in group differences, mean differences, correlations. We
Yeah,
want to get to the causality.
yep, because similar to like how every model has an error term or the concept of endogeneity or bias, like just because you see a significant result, someone can say, how do you know these results aren't biased because you didn't include this variable, or this variable? So
Yeah.
that's why causality is really important.
Yeah, yeah. That is spot on. That is spot on. We cover some of that in this course too. Having that kind of spuriousness accounted for and
Hmm.
how much of it can you really account for in some models.
Yep.
It's funny that you brought up kind of the limitation and lack of data. I was talking to a colleague the other day. We have this project where we're looking at fatalities in correctional facilities, and we're looking at opioid related fatalities. And we have a bunch of controls and covariates in there, and we have this expected relationship. We things we expect to see,
Hmm.
and we cross ran it against with another colleague of ours, and she mentioned what about methadone clinics? She's like, if you were able to kind of plot the physical location of methadone clinics to these facilities and so forth, maybe that may also influence and explain some of the variation that you see in your outcome.
Mhm.
And one of the things we initially thought was like, oh yeah, that actually aligns with the framework we're working with. Um, where can we get that data though? Right? That became the big piece. Like, can we get that data point? Which puts us in a predicament where it's like, if we get it, perfect. If we don't, and we know that this is a variable that can impact our outcome, the best we can do is just be transparent as researchers, as evaluators at that point, and just kind of put it in our limitations section.
Yep, similar. And in most cases for us, understanding that scope, and there's always going to be like multiple different areas you can go to, but that's where I know we joked about reviewer too, but why like going through the peer review process can be beneficial because 9 times out of 10 they'll highlight, okay, like your limitations section, or this is where like what you're doing is great work, ideas here, but you face data limitations and you need to be upfront with how you said, and why we have like is replication common in your field too?
Yeah, yeah. So you'll get some replication studies for sure. Mhm.
Yeah. So the fact that you have to be able to replicate your study just showcases that.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, significant coefficients, just a little bit more.
Right. Right. So, um, I have one more question here on my cheat sheet, and it's pretty much a catch-all that I ask everyone that I've had a chance to talk with, which is pretty much in the area of research and evaluation. Are there any pieces you think we didn't cover today? I know this is a short, informal conversation, but are there any pieces we didn't cover today that you want to make note of that you'd like to kind of share with some of the folks who are going to tune in to this for the course?
Definitely. So we touched on like because we're focused on policy interventions, I didn't get a chance to mention one of the policy interventions in the game theory part. So I mentioned that the residence two types was based upon if they were trusting or skeptical. And I'm briefly mentioned that the stakeholders had two types where it was like price discount and normal. But I want those two types of stakeholders are actually based on real policies, such as, are you familiar with SNAP?
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
But
So
if you can break that down or just explain what SNAP is.
yep. So SNAP, formerly known as food stamp, stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, where it offers people that qualify, which typically fall under like low income, like a EBT voucher where you can purchase, or card where you can purchase like certain foods, like specifically like it's a list of foods and products that you can actually get. And it's pretty much to help like people that are more food insecure. I mean, that wasn't its intention, but that's what it's can be used for.
Hmm.
So not a lot, majority of grocery stores or supermarkets and a couple of farmers markets offer SNAP. It's fairly common. So it can be viewed as more the traditional way of opening of a traditional store. So the price discount part is a program that's offered that's a relatively like smaller program called GusNIP, which is Gus Schumacher Nutrition Incentive Grant Program, which offers a one-to-one match or 50% discount on SNAP allowable foods. And unlike SNAP, where SNAP, like there's certain products under SNAP that aren't necessarily healthy, GusNIP is primarily for fruits and vegetables. So it can be viewed as an intervention or incentive to eat healthier. And unfortunately with GusNIP, there's incentives like you can't like funding only lasts a set amount of time, and it's very competitive. Like it's very difficult to kind of like receive it. So what this study is supposed to highlight is if you offer a price discount or offer a GusNIP store, people may be willing to like trust going to the store because you offer a price discount. So that was one of the bigger outcomes or factors in the game that I just wanted to touch on, given the policy intervention. Because and the hope is to showcase the need or importance of if you're in a community where they don't trust you,
Hmm.
I highly recommend having like it being able to like showcase the impact of a GusNIP store
Yeah,
and
yeah,
just the overall, just a one shoe fits all system doesn't work in a community if they don't trust you.
Right, right, right. I follow. You just added another layer when you mentioned the policy piece to it, right? Because now it's GusNet versus Snap in the model,
Hmm.
um, and then how the consumers where they land in terms of those survey sentiments and how that kind of interacts with those two options to produce successful or unsuccessful outcomes for
Yep.
this. Okay.
And essentially it's two games. So like one for each stakeholder type. So you
Hmm.
can compare like what's optimal for the GusNip store is different than what's optimal for the Snap store. Like
Right.
there's a lot more unsuccessful outcomes for the Snap store compared to the GusNip store. But the GusNip store follows a more distinct pattern.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there's pros and cons. Like there's pros and cons to either one. But and that was just to highlight like you have options to choose from given a trust setting or a trust framework.
Right. Right. Oh, we got a link to that dissertation. When I upload this, I have to add that link into that into the description because I think this also speaks to like a broader beauty of research and program development over time is that like something like this, um, you can use those results to inform like future programming, right?
Mm,
So it's like, hey, if research shows us that under these circumstances, this type of intervention works or it doesn't work for this type of target population under these circumstances, then maybe you take that information to then inform what the actual program looks like if you were going to create something different somewhere else or something like that. It's kind of like this big cyclical relationship of
mhm.
having a program evaluation uh, rooted in research, having that evaluation produce outcomes that can then go right back into
Yep.
development of a program.
Yep. And what you also highlighted is pretty much the aspect of the Bayesian process where a prior can be updated with data and can be used in the future. So you can always constantly update it or yeah.
That's awesome. Anything else, Dr. Grant, that you might want to put out there in your remaining time?
Nothing pretty much major. Just another aspect working on is just understanding food access and just mapping it out, creating maps. And yeah, I think that's the big thing.
Oh, now you got to speak a little bit more to that. You kind of just threw that one. Oh, what do you mean in terms of mapping out food access and what does that tend to look like in terms of like data and just to make sense out of it?
So right now I'm collaborating with some co-authors in my field on, as I mentioned, continuous food access can is or food access is pretty much based on typically in the past binary like yes or no,
Hmm.
but it's really more continuous. And there's other factors that can impact like food access, such as like where you live, where you work, and aspects such as walkability. Another important factor is why food access is important is food insecurity. So food access is one of the pillars within the concept of food insecurity or unability or unaffordability of healthy foods. So what this paper pretty much touches on is what are the components that touch on like specifically food insecurity, such as food accessibility, meaning like the number of stores in the area, the history of that area, such as if I lived in this community my whole life and I've seen at this specific address numerous grocery stores come and go. Like since I've been there for like 30 years, I've seen six come and go. I may not believe this current iteration of a store that's going to open here is going to last.
Right.
Therefore, I'm not going to trust it's going to last. I'm going to keep going where I want to go, like outside of town. So seeing if that component's important, seeing if a component such as transportation, like if I have a car and I'm more likely to go outside of like my area versus if I don't have a car, how do I react? So it's just comparing the different components within food access and like seeing how it affects or correlates with food insecurity.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. This is pretty cool. Well, look, if you ever create a course over at Econ, I'd love to share it with students. Shoot, I might become a student myself. It sounds like some pretty cool stuff, especially the mapping component on some of those aspects would be pretty
Oh yeah,
nice to learn how to do.
yeah,
Um,
I love making maps, and I know we've like talked and shown maps.
you know. Well, Dr. Grant, I want to say thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today, speak with the class today, and looking forward to you doing great things. I'll link to your contact information and any other materials you think are worth sharing with students. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.